Hey everybody, thanks for joining us for worship today. Whether you're at home or maybe you're with one of our great partners like Westmote, we're so glad that we get to spend this little bit of our day together. Hey folks, we are in week 2 of a worship series we've called Family Vacation. And the quintessential family vacation is a road trip, right? Who of us has not been on a road trip? And if you've been on a road trip, you know, because you're traveling with family, you're traveling with that brother, that sister, you're traveling in close quarters, you know it's not long on that road trip before there's a little bit of whining, a little bit of complaining, a little bit of belly aching. You know what I'm talking about. For example, if you have kids at all like our kids, at the beginning of the trip, in the back seat, they draw an imaginary line down the middle of the back seat. This is my side, this is your side. And of course, you know what happens. Not far down the road, you hear one of them scream, "He crossed the line." And I got to be honest, as a dad, I want to turn around and say to them, there is plenty of room in that back seat for both of you. How would you like to ride in the trunk? Or how about this one? My boys do this all the time. The music we play. We give each of them a turn to pick out the music that we play on the road trip. But it never fails that one of them will holler out, "Why does he get to pick the music all the time?" I want to tell them we've got 1,000 miles worth of music to listen to. You'll get your turn. Or this is the quintessential one, right? Of course, you've stopped at a road stop for lunch. You've stopped at a fast food restaurant or a gas station, and not 5 miles down the road, somebody screams, "I've got to go potty," right? Seriously. Or my boys, they do this one all the time. You've just stopped at Culver's. They've had the giant triple stacker burger, and we're about 10 miles down the road, and that's when one of them says, "I'm hungry." I want to look at them and say, do you know how many canisters of Pringles you've eaten in the last 5 miles? Seriously. When you're on a road trip, there's never, ever enough. Am I right? Well, here's the thing. All that whining, all that complaining, our kids, our families, they aren't the first ones to whine and complain on a road trip. In fact, a few thousand years ago, God's people took the longest road trip ever. It was a 40-year road trip. It involved 600,000 people, and it was led by a guy named Moses. Now, let me tell you this. They whined, they complained, they bellyached and quarreled the entire time. Again, folks, we're in the second week of a series we've called Family Vacation. And nothing says family vacation like a road trip. And so this summer, we're going on a road trip. And we're not getting into vans and sort of caravanning anywhere together. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the road trips we find in the Bible. Because trips or journeys that people took in the Bible, they were always a metaphor, if you will, an analogy, a sort of metaphor for a life lived in relationship with God. And folks, isn't that what we're searching for ourselves? And so we're taking a look at all these road trips in the Bible in order to better understand, what does a life lived in relationship with God, well, what does it look like? And so last week we kicked off the series and we talked about a road trip that Abraham was on with God. And we talked about, as we begin this road trip, as Abraham began his road trip, God invited Abraham to consider 3 things. The first was this, to leave some things behind. And you and I, in our lives, sometimes we've got to leave some things behind. The second thing God did is God said, Abraham, it's time to go. Abraham got stuck on his journey. And sometimes you and I, we get comfortable in our lives. And God says, no, it's time to move. It's time to go. And lastly, God says to Abraham, you will be a blessing. And God promises the very same thing to people like you and me. When we live in relationship with God, our lives are a blessing to all those around us. That was week 1. And if you missed week 1 of the series, I want to invite you to go back, go to our website, go to YouTube, and you can catch up. But today we're going to talk about another character, and his name was Moses. Moses is a prophet who's recognized in all the 3 major faiths, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Now, the story of Moses, if you grew up going to Sunday school, or maybe you saw the movie The 10 Commandments, you know the story. God's people were living in the promised land when there was a famine. And so they made their way to Egypt. And at the time, the Pharaoh welcomed them with open arms, and there was more than enough food for them to eat in Egypt. Several hundred years passed, and God's people remained there in Egypt. But then an evil, a jealous Pharaoh came to power. And this Pharaoh became very jealous of the Israelite people because their population had exponentially increased. And so this jealous, evil Pharaoh did 2 things. The first was he enslaved God's people. He forced them to do hard labor, building bricks in the hot desert sun, building the great empire that was the Egyptian empire. The second thing he forced those Egyptians to do is this. He had his army kill all of the male children born to the Israelite people. And so Moses' mother, when Moses was born, placed baby Moses into a basket, placed that basket in the Nile River, and as the legend goes, the daughter of the Pharaoh found that basket with baby Moses in it. And she brought him home, and there in the Pharaoh's palace, she raised baby Moses to become an adult. Well, when Moses was an adult, the story goes that God said, now is the time. I'm done with this slavery business, and Moses, you are going to lead your people out of slavery. Now is the time, Moses. And so you know the story. Moses listened to God's call, and if you grew up in Sunday school or are a fan of Charlton Heston, you know what Moses did. He went to Pharaoh and he said, let my people go. And Moses would lead God's people out of Egypt, out of slavery. And here's sort of the map of where he led them. He led them out of Egypt, across the Red Sea. He led them all the way down to Mount Sinai, where he received the 10 Commandments. And eventually they would make their way to the land of Canaan, the promised land. As they would make their way out of Egypt, God had just freed them from slavery. They headed out to the desert. They got to the Red Sea, and what did God do? God parted the waters so they could make their way into the desert. And when the Egyptian armies made their way across the Red Sea, the waters came together and crushed Pharaoh's army. But here's the interesting thing about the story, and this is why we're telling the story of Moses today. The moment they came across the Red Sea, as they entered the wilderness, do you know what those Israelites did the entire trip? They whined, they complained, they bellyached, they quarreled, just like your kids in the back seat on those road trips you endured with your family the entire way. The story goes like this. It says, then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its waters because it was bitter. There was something about the water they didn't like. I don't know if it wasn't fizzy enough. It wasn't clarified enough. I don't know what it was they didn't like. It wasn't to their liking. So the people, what did they do? They grumbled against Moses. They grumbled, they bellyached, they whined, they complained. So what did God do? Well, God gave Moses a piece of wood that he was to place in the water, and it turned the water from bitter to sweet, some of the best water the people had ever tasted. But that wasn't enough. Just a few verses later, in the desert, the Israelites, what did they do? They grumbled, saying, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt, if only God had just killed us rather than taking us out of slavery. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into the desert to starve us to death. The ironic thing is God heard this. And God would provide in the morning a form of bread that was on the ground. They called it manna. Every night, as the people began to kind of come together and prepare dinner, God would provide quail that would come into their camp. God provided all they needed. But again, that wasn't enough. In just a few verses later, it says, the whole Israelite community set out traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. But there was not water for the people to drink, so what did they do? Again, they quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. And that's when God said to Moses, I want you to take your staff and drop it on the rock. And when he did, it gushed forth with water. You see, they grumbled just like your kids and my kids on those big, long road trips because, there was never enough. For those Israelite people, there was just never enough. Back in the 90s, there was a television program. Maybe you remember it. It was called Hoarders. Does anyone remember this show? It played for 13 seasons, 143 episodes. And in each episode, they would go into the home of someone who struggled with hoarding. They would walk through the home, and by the end of the show, they would have someone come in and clean it up. They would have maybe a psychologist or a counselor work with the person who owned the home. Now, I don't know if I really believed that hoarders existed until I was in high school and I had a teacher who had a relative who had to move out of their home. And we were to go in. He invited me to help him clean up a few things, to go into the house and clean it up so they could sell it. And I will never forget opening the door to that house for the very first time. There were two paths that were about 6 inches wide. One led from the front door back to the kitchen, and the other went up the stairs to the bedroom. Other than that, there were stacks and stacks of stuff everywhere. There were clothes, there were stacks of books, thousands of books. There were packages everywhere that had never even been opened. Experts, they suggest that hoarding is actually a mental disorder. It's a mental disorder that has our brain telling us that there is never, we never have enough. When I think of that hoarder's home that I was invited to help clean up a bit, I wonder if that was just an extreme example of what those Israelites experienced so long ago. There was never enough. God had provided, but it wasn't enough. And I wonder if that hoarder is an example, an extreme example of something that's been around forever, something that, if we're honest, something that people like you and me, we experience all the time. You see, those Israelites, God provided enough, but there was never enough. Here's what I wonder. I think people like you and me, we've come to understand that when it comes to greed, there's a certain way we measure it. I mean, we look at people who are hoarders and we say, I can't imagine that kind of greed. With all their stuff, their hundreds of articles of clothing, thousands of books, the unopened package, I can't imagine that kind of greed. And I think we do that because we've come to sort of understand that greed is measured by how much we have. If that's the case, there's some tension for us, as Americans especially. Consider this statistic. If you make more than $33,000 a year, you are among the wealthiest 4% of people in the entire world. You see, I wonder if greed is greed, not because of how much we have. I wonder if greed is greed because it's this sort of unquenchable need for more. It's this never being satisfied that has a hold on us. I mean, for a minute, do this. Put your hands out. Come on, do it. And make a fist. Isn't this how we were raised when it comes to our stuff? That we've got to hold on to it. We've got to amass a whole bunch, and we got to hold on to it. You see, it's interesting. Those Israelites, God rescued them from slavery, only for them to find their way out in the desert, and there they were enslaved by a different kind of slavery. They were slaves to a fear of not having enough. When my boys were little, probably like your kids, my boys, when one of them would get something new, maybe it was a gift or maybe it was a treat, the other boy would always do this. I want it, right? Do you remember that? And then the boy who got the whatever it was, the toy, the cookie, whatever it was, do you remember what they would do? They would take it into their arms and clutch it as tight as they can. They'd run behind the couch and hide and say, "It's mine." Right? Isn't that a definition of greed? It's this unrelenting inability to share. Mother Teresa, at one point in her life, was asked a question. She was serving the poor in Calcutta. We all know the story of Mother Teresa. She was serving the poor, and someone looked at her and said, "How can you believe in a God, Mother Teresa? How can you believe in a God who would allow so many people to live in poverty?" And that's when Mother Teresa looked back at this man and said these words. She said, "Poverty exists in the world not because of God, but because God's children, we refuse to share." If I were to ask you this question, I think I know your answer. If I were to ask you, how big was Jesus's wealth? I mean, what was his net income? I think you would look at me kind of strange, as though that's an odd question, because I think we all assume that Jesus lived a life of poverty. He didn't have anything. He lived off the generosity of others, which to some extent was true. But he did have a measure of wealth. If you look at the details in the Bible, remember, when he was born, the wise men, what did they do? They brought him extravagant gifts. He had some measure of wealth. In the Gospels, it talks about how Jesus made Judas sort of the chief financial officer for the disciples. He was in charge of their purse. Jesus had some measure of wealth. He owned stuff. But here's the thing about Jesus. Jesus owned stuff, but his stuff didn't own him. You see, you and I, we were raised like this. But Jesus was always sort of living this life that was trying to teach those disciples, to invite us to live a life like this, an open-handed sort of life. Those Israelites, there was never enough for them. They were out in the desert. God provided all they needed, provided water and bread and meat in the form of quail. Jesus provided it again and again. But they bellyached. And so God wanted to sort of teach them what a life, an open-handed life looks like. And so he gave specific instructions to Moses to give to the people as to how they were to gather all of this that God had provided. Moses listened to God, and then it says, Moses instructed the Israelites, everyone is to gather as much as they need. Say that again, as much as they need. They aren't to stockpile. They aren't to sort of fill their bags in case there isn't more tomorrow. No, God is going to provide. He says, I want you to gather as much as you need. Take an omer. An omer was a unit of measurement. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent. He gave them these instructions, and then it says, so the Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some little. And when they measured it by the omer, by this unit of measurement, the ones who gathered much did not have too much, and the ones who gathered little did not have too little. Everyone had gathered, say this with me, just as much as they needed. There was plenty. But what was God trying to teach them? Well, there was all this God provided. And there was more than enough for everyone, if only they could learn to share. You see, God was sort of giving them instructions to practice. You see, they had grown up just like us with these clenched fists. But God was saying that there's a better way to live. It's an open-handed life. And out there in the desert, God gave them instructions as to how they could practice. You see, you and I, this closed-fisted sort of living is so much a part of who we are. I wonder what it would look like for us to actually practice a sort of open-handed life. But here's what I want to wonder. Over the next week, what if we actually did this? Now you're going, well, how would I practice living this way? Well, let me give you a couple of suggestions, huh? How about this? What if we were to make sharing an everyday sort of thing? What if you were to give something away every day this week? Doesn't have to be anything big. It can be a compliment. You can give away a compliment to someone maybe you don't believe deserves it, right? Give a compliment away. It doesn't cost you anything. Send a text message to somebody you care about. Maybe somebody forgot their lunch at work. Give them your lunch. You know you don't need it. Or you're sitting around the campfire at night and you got your favorite hoodie on and somebody forgot their hoodie. You know you've got 16 hoodies in your closet. Give them one of them. Let them keep it. Huh? Maybe you buy coffee for the guy behind you in line at the coffee shop. I don't know what it looks like, but you know as well as I do, you got more than enough. So let's give something away every day. It doesn't have to be big. Or how about this? What if you were to practice hospitality? Most of us, we live in spaces that are more than we need. What if we were to practice hospitality? Invite someone into your space. Share a meal together. And lastly, what if? I think this is an important one. The most important practice. What if we were to remember each and every day our place in this world? Remember, if you make $33,000 or more per year, you are among the 4% of the wealthiest people in the world. You are rich. You've been blessed. Folks, we're on a road trip. It's time to practice. Those Israelites, they grumbled all the way, and we've been on road trips. We know what that grumbling is like. And if we're honest, we do the same thing. We grumble because we feel as though we've been raised with this idea there's never enough. But here's the truth. We have a God who's blessed us with more than enough.
I was buried beneath my shame. Who could carry that kind of weight? It was my tomb till I met you. I was breathing but not alive. All my failures I tried to hide. It was my tomb till I met you. Hey! You called my name and I ran out like grace. Out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name and I ran out like grace. Out of the darkness to your glorious day. Now your mercy has saved my soul. Now your freedom is all that I know. The old me knew Jesus when I met you. Oh, you called my name and I ran out like grace. Out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name and I ran out. I needed rescue, my sin was heavy. Chains break at the weight of your glory. I needed shelter, it was an orphan, but you call me a citizen of heaven. When I was broken, you were my healing. Your love is the air that I'm breathing. I have a future, my eyes are open, 'cause when you called my name, I ran out like grace. Out of the darkness, into your glorious day. You called my name, and I ran out like grace. Out of the darkness, into your glorious day.
At this time, I invite you to join me as together we say the words of the Lord's Prayer. Together we pray, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Hey folks, thank you. Thanks for joining us today. It's an honor to spend a little bit of this day with you today. If you're new to Calvary, we are so excited that you've chosen to hang around with us here. Well, we'd invite you to consider maybe taking a next step with us. It's an easy one. Head out to our website, calvaryalec.org, and there hit the button that says sign up for emails. It's a way for you to kind of become informed about all the opportunities you have to join us on the journey of faith. It's just a little next step we invite you to take. Another thing we're doing, one of those opportunities for you to kind of grow in faith, is through a new online Bible study we're launching this week. We're going to make our way through the book of Exodus, the story we just talked about today. We're going to begin at the beginning of that journey and go to the very end, and we're going to find how through that journey God freed God's people in more ways than you could ever imagine. You can use the QR code on the screen or go to our website to sign up for that. We also, if you have little ones and you live in the Alexandria area, we'd love for you to get your kid or your neighbor kid or your grandkid signed up for Vacation Bible School. Vacation Bible School is open to all kids. It's absolutely free, and it's going to be totally fun. We can't wait to have your kid, your neighbor kid, your grandkid join us this summer. Last but not least, if you're ever in the Alexandria community, we'd love for you to join us for our special summer ministry. On Sunday mornings, we take our 10:30 service out to Luther Crest Bible Camp. We worship outdoors, lakeside. It's a ton of fun. Come early at 9:30. We'll serve you brunch. It's a tasty brunch. Come at 10:30, and you can join us for worship. Folks, thanks so much for being with us. As we close today, as we always do, we want to invite you to live the generous life that God calls us to, a God who provides us with more than enough. As we close, we're going to collect our offerings in the ways on the screen. You're invited to make your offering. Maybe you'll choose to go online to our website, hit the button that says Give. There you can sign up for a one-time or a reoccurring gift. If you have the app Venmo on your phone, just use our handle and you can make your gift that way. Or you can just simply write out a check, drop it in the mail to the address on the screen. Now, we know that sometimes people want to make a special gift. If you want to make a special gift this summer, just give us a call in the church office. We'd love to talk to you about how it is that you want to live out that life, that generous life that God calls every last one of us to. Folks, thanks for joining us on this road trip. We'll see you next week.